Did you know that there's a cake that doubles as a crumble? It's right here, my apple crumble cake. And it is 3 bites for this giant slice. And you're gonna love it. I'll show you next. Hello and welcome to my kitchen. My name is Roy. I am a home cook and amateur baker, and I am here on this channel sharing recipes that have helped me to lose over 125 pounds, whether those recipes are mine or someone else's. Today's recipe is going to be one of mine. It's for an apple crumble cake, not an apple crumble. You get an apple crumble and you get a cake. Why not? Now this recipe can be found on my blog, so make sure you check there. The link is down below in the description box. And I thought I would start, I'd already started cutting up some of my apples. And I thought maybe I should show you guys how to cut these apples. We're just dicing them up. And I did put a little lime juice on these because they were sitting out and I'm recording. You don't have to do that, but I didn't want them turning brown before I got ready to use them. This is how I do it. I cut off the edges all around the core. And then get rid of this. I'll probably nibble on a bit later, whatever is left there. Then I'm going to start with probably the smallest piece. And because it's still a little thick, I'm going to slice that in half, cut once down this way. And then just dice them up. See, they're probably about the size of a large pea maybe a little bit bigger than that. But so that's all I do with all of them, is I just cut through the middle to separate this and make them a little smaller. And then go across, and then across again. Okay, let me just, because this apple that was sitting out, which didn't have any lime juice on it, it's starting to get a little brown, so let me toss that in with the stuff that does have some lime juice on it so that it doesn't go any further. And then I will get this out of the way because I'm going to show you once again, just in case somebody hasn't seen it, I'm going to make a sling for my cake pan. It's a 9x9 cake pan. You don't have to do a sling. I only do it because it's far easier to lift it out, but you really don't need to. So let me get this off to the side and I'll show you that. Okay, now I know I've shown this before, so if you don't need to see it, you can jump ahead a little bit. But I'm just going to spray the pan with Pam, and I use the baking Pam whenever I am baking. I just prefer using that, but you could use regular Pam if that's what you had. So I'm going to spray it before I put any of the foil in it, because this will help the foil to stick to the pan and stay in place rather than slide around. It still may slide a little bit, but. And then I'm just going to check where this should be folded to fit into the pan. You get out of the way, please. Thank you. And I'm going to fold a little bit beyond where the demarcation was. I'm going to, yeah, hello, I can talk. I'm going to go a little more inside the foil than where the line is, because the outside of a cake pan doesn't allow for the measurement of the metal. So I usually go a little more in because it doesn't have to fit precisely. And then I'm going to just press it down. I don't know why I always overdo it on the foil. But it is what it is. Okay, so you want to keep it as flat as possible, because if you wrinkle it too much, which I started to do over on this side, it will show up in the cake. But it's not really that big of a deal because it's not a cake we're going to frost or anything. All right, so that's done. Let me get this out of the way and bring in the other ingredients. Okay, so rather than doing all of the ingredients at once, because I will admit this is a little more involved than most of the other recipes I've shared. Not horribly, but there are just a lot of components, because there is a topping, there is an apple layer, and then there is the cake. Now, none of them are that involved really, but it's just a lot to see, and I don't want to overwhelm you with 5 million ingredients on the counter, and you're like, no, I can't do this. It's easy when you break it down into parts. So this is the topping. Oh, and I forgot to mention that I created this recipe based on a recipe that I found online at Bake with Shay. And I will leave the link to the actual original recipe down below. So for the topping, we have a half a cup of flour. We have 3 tablespoons of light butter. We have a 1/3 cup of granulated sugar replacement. I use Swerve, as many of you may know. And the brown sugar replacement, also a 1/3 cup, and also Swerve. Then there is a 1/3 cup of old-fashioned oats. You could use quick oats, but I prefer the texture of the old-fashioned oats. And then in here we have a pinch of salt and half a teaspoon of cinnamon. And you could bump that up if you like a little more cinnamon flavor. It's your call. So the first thing I'm going to do is microwave this butter so that it's melted just a little bit. Okay, now here's a little secret that I use that you may not know. It says in the recipe that the butter should be melted and cooled. It doesn't have to be cold, you just don't want it hot. So what you can do is, instead of melting it and then letting it sit, if say you ran out of time or you decided to make this at the last minute, microwave the light butter for maybe about 15-20 seconds so that there is still some of the butter remaining. Then you're going to just mix that up so that the melted butter will then melt the solid pieces. And the solid pieces will then cool down the melted butter, because they're not fully melted, they're not fully heated. So you get a win-win. You don't have to stress if you forgot to melt the butter. Just melt it for a short time and then mix it together. So into our bowl, we're going to put the flour and the sweeteners. And I like to break up, I like to break up the brown sugar a little bit because it does tend to clump. Going to add in the cinnamon and salt now that the brown sugar is broken up, and whisk that all in. Okay, now we don't need the whisk. We're going to stir in the oats. And once again, I throw it all over. And I'm just using the same spatula I stirred the butter with. It's not that big of a deal. And you're just going to mix this into a homogeneous mixture. I don't know why I can't keep things in a bowl. I see one clump of brown sugar in there trying to evade me. So now, you go out of the way. So now we're going to add in the melted butter. I'm just going to pour that all over. And just toss it around. Now, like I usually say, you don't want like a giant clump when you're doing a crumble. You're going to want it to be broken up into little bits at some point. So this amount of the butter should be sufficient to moisten everything, to let it clump a little bit. I think that looks good right here. Oh, there's a little, see? It's a good thing I toss it from the bottom, because sometimes there is some sugary, powdery, floury bits hiding down below. But you can see it's not fully clumped, but it is forming clumps, and that's what you want. So I'm now going to set this aside and we will work on the apples. Okay, I chose too small of a bowl for the apples, so I moved my crumble topping into a Pyrex measuring cup for now and used that bowl. There's still a little bit of the seasoning and stuff in it, but it's not going to matter because it's all going to bake together anyway. So for the apples, you want baking apples, apples that are sturdier to stand up to baking. These are, what are these? These are Granny Smith apples, which is my preference. It's usually the preferred baking apple, but you can also use Gala, Braeburns, Honeycrisp, other kinds. You can look up online what in your area would be considered a baking apple. So we're just going to we have 2 apples here that I diced, and I showed you the dicing process. And on top of the apples, we have a 1/4 cup of brown sugar replacement, again swerve. And in here, I have 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. I have a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, and I have 1/8 of a teaspoon of allspice, and a pinch of salt. Now, if you didn't want to buy all of those separate spices, you could just use, like they have an apple pie spice mix. I think McCormick might have it. Others may as well. You can just use like a tablespoon. You can just use like 1.5 teaspoons of that instead. I'm going to sprinkle that over the apples and just toss the apples so that they all get a little bit of that flavoring on there before we add in the sugar. The apples are well coated. You can see they have like a brownish tinge to them now. And because of the nature of brown sugar, I'm going to crumble this over the top and then toss it. And then just toss that together. And the juice or moisture in the apples will help it to melt so that it coats the apples a little bit better than it did as a big clump. Okay, that looks perfect. That's our apple layer. So 2 layers down, 1 layer left to go. So let me grab those ingredients and we'll move on. Okay, for the cake portion of this cake, we have 3/4 cup of flour. I have 1/3 cup of almond milk, 1/3 cup of unsweetened applesauce, 1/3 cup of swerve sweetener, whatever sweetener you choose. It should be a 1-to-1 replacement for sugar. If it's like stevia, which I believe is stronger, you would have to adjust that to equal 1/3 cup. I have 1 egg here. I have 1 teaspoon of baking powder and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Now you might be asking, why do you need both? Isn't 1 sufficient? Typically, yes, you would use just 1 in most recipes, but when you see a recipe using both, it's because there is some sort of acidic component in the recipe. In this case, it's the apples. There's a bit of acid in the apples. You need both of them because 1 will counteract some of that acid and allow for the lift. If you had too much acid in a recipe, it would kill off some of the reaction, so you wouldn't have the lift that you want in a cake or a muffin or whatever it is. So by adding the extra, what we do is that piece, the baking soda, will neutralize the acid while the baking powder gets to work. It's kind of like if you were trying to trick your parent or your teacher, and you had your friend doing one thing over here while you were doing something over here. That's what it's like when you have baking soda and baking powder together. One is interacting with the teacher or parent, the acid, and the other one is doing the work. In here we have a half a teaspoon of cinnamon again. We have a quarter teaspoon of nutmeg and a half teaspoon of salt. You need salt inside the cake because salt enhances the flavor. All right, so we're going to combine all of the dry ingredients. And you are not a dry ingredient. Out of the way, sir. Or ma'am, I don't know. Could be non-binary, I don't have any idea. Anyway, the flour, the sugar. Now I know in a previous recipe, I did say that a lot of times sugar goes in with the liquid because it dissolves and becomes part of the liquid. But that's not always the case. You don't have to always do that. Just do whatever the recipe says and you should be fine. You could add it to the liquid and it wouldn't harm anything. So don't worry about that. The baking soda and baking powder and the salt and spices, and just whisk that all up. Again, like I said before, when you're whisking all of the dry ingredients together, it's because you are trying to get everything evenly distributed. So you're not having pockets of baking powder or baking soda, pockets of salt, pockets of cinnamon. It's all spread throughout. So you're not getting any little pockets of one particular thing that could affect the rest of the cake. That's good. Actually, let me use my whisk to break up that egg a bit. And I'll add that in, as well as the applesauce. I was going to use the silicone spatula, but it doesn't seem like I need to. Let me put this aside. And then we're just going to whisk this together. Now you don't want to over mix any sort of batter like this, any sort of cake, any sort of pancake, any sort of muffin. You want to do it just until it comes together. And it's already together. You can see it's homogeneous. If you over mix, what can happen is you're mixing more gluten into the batter. So it's going to make it tougher, more like a bread. You don't want gluten in here if you can help it. So you usually just want to stir a cake or a muffin or a pancake just until it comes together, and then let it sit there for a minute or two so that it can soak everything in. All right, so let me get everything back together so we can get this cake in the oven, and I will be right back. Now, we're going to do our 3 layers here. First up is the cake, followed by the apples, followed by the topping, hence the name topping. All right, so we're just going to scrape this in. Now this is going to be a very, very thin layer. And you're going to be like, there is not enough cake in here. It will be fine, trust me. It will look like it won't be, but it will. And just spread that around. Now see how thin this is. It's barely, I mean, it's covering the bottom, but very thinly. Okay, and let's just shake it a little bit to even it out. So the next step is to add the apples, which is the middle layer, and you're just going to evenly distribute those all over the cake. If you like an apple crumble, and it's getting, sadly, it's getting to that season, apples are going to be all around. This is a perfect recipe. Combines the best of 2 worlds, gives you some cake, gives you some apple crumble. And that goes in there, and I'm just gonna spread this around lightly so I'm not disturbing the cake batter too much. And it doesn't have to be pressed in like we did with the blueberry cream cheese crumb bars. You don't have to press the apples into the batter. Their weight will kind of pull them down into it. And when the cake starts to bake, it'll also swell up around it. So that looks good. Now, the crumb topping. So like I said, this is a 9x9 pan, and this makes, as I did it, this makes 6 servings. You could alter the servings if you want, but I will tell you that it's 3 bites for 6 servings, but it's also 3 bites each if you had 8 servings. So why not have a bigger serving? Except for you, Sandy. Sandy from Let's Get Fit with Sandy. I know you're trying to watch your portions so you can make a smaller piece. And I also had a pal of mine, Rosemary, who's a subscriber. She's also part of our Facebook groups. Ask what the bites or points would be if you used regular sugar. So I calculated those because some people can't tolerate sugar replacements. So I calculated the bites or points. If you don't know, I'm on the iTrackBites Better Balance plan, which is the equivalent of the WW Blue plan. So when I calculated this with regular sugar and brown sugar, 6 servings came up to 12 bites each. If you cut it down to 8 servings, it would be 9 bites each. And if you cut it down to 10 servings, it would be 7 bites each. The calories would go up to 321 from 184, which is what this recipe is. Now the macros, oddly enough, the fat and protein stay the same, whether you use real sugar or replacement. The thing that threw me off was the carbs. Using real sugar, I got 69.3 grams of carbs. But for my recipe, which uses no real sugar, the carbs went up to 80.2 grams. I have no idea. It was surprising to me. But it doesn't really affect the macros too much, except in the carbohydrates. You actually get a fewer carbohydrates if you use regular sugar. The calories jump up and the bites definitely jump up. But Rosemary, there is your information, and I will try to do that for all of my sweet recipes or anything that uses an artificial sweetener, just for those people who maybe can't tolerate it. That way you will have more information. So this is going to go into a 375-degree oven for about 30 to 35 minutes until a toothpick inserted in the center comes out with a few moist crumbs. That way you know there's still some moistness in the cake and it's not completely dry. So let me get this into the oven and we will be back when it comes out. Okay, and there you have it, an apple crumble cake. Looks like an apple crumble, but there's a cake hiding underneath. Now, we have to let this cool for an hour in the pan. Then I will remove it, slice into it, and show you the goodness that waits inside. You're not gonna wanna miss it. Be right back. So it has been an hour, maybe a little bit more. Going to take this cake out and see it with the sling. It is much easier to remove. I mean, it wouldn't really be too much of a problem to flip it upside down into your hand and then flip it out, but I just enjoy the ease and comfort of not having to do that. Okay, so there it is, the apple crumble cake. Now I need to cut it, so I need to take off my progressives. If you've been watching this channel at all, you know it makes my vision wavery. Not that I can cut much better without them. So I'm cutting this into 6 portions. And like I said, you could go for doing 8 if you'd like. You could do 10, but I like a healthy portion, especially when it comes to desserts, because I want to feel like I'm having a treat and not like I'm given a taste. You know what I mean? So, there you have it. Apple crumble cake. Moist. Definitely could smell the cinnamon, especially when it was baking. But this is going to be a perfect fall treat, or any time of the year, really. For 1/6 of this cake, one big slab like this, only 3 bites. If you were to cut it into 8, as I said previously, it would still be 3 bites. So why not have a slightly bigger portion? I know it's more satisfying to me, and I don't feel deprived because I'm getting a nice chunk of cake. For calories, there is 184 calories per slice. Fat, as I said previously, was 3.9 grams. Carbs on this are 80.2 grams. And the protein is 4.6 grams. So you have a delicious treat here. You could even cut them into smaller bits if you want. You do you. You do whatever you need to do for your weight loss journey. I'm not here to dictate. I'm just here to give you some guides, and then you take it from there. So as I said before, the recipe for this can be found along with my other recipes on my blog, which is linked down below. You can also follow me on Instagram, and I will leave my handle here. Also, there are 2 Facebook groups that I am admin on. One is the one I am the sole admin of, called Recipes with Roy, and you can see that icon here. And then there is one that I share the admin duties with Jennifer Lynn of the Jennifer Lynn channel and Bree Coleman of Balancing Life with Bree. So the 3 of us are the admins on Finding Our Way, WEIGH. And you'll see the icon here so you know you're finding the right place. So I hope you enjoyed this recipe. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate that. Also, subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. And hit the notification bell for the next time I upload any sort of video. Wednesdays I usually do short, quicker videos, and Fridays are usually something a little more involved like this. Also, comment down below if you're an apple person. You could probably change the fruit up if you'd like. You could probably try peaches, and I might add some ginger to go with the peach. So there are other alternatives that you can do. You can play around with these things. But I hope you will give it a try nonetheless. It's a delicious treat, especially with fall coming up. You're gonna love it. And I think I'm going to go have some of this right now. Till next time, bye.